So I would now like to hand over. So firstly, our panelists are threefold. We have Professor Tim Higenbottam, who's President of the Faculty of Medicine of the Royal College of Physicians. We have Professor Alan Boyd, who's a Boyd's consultant and was the immediate past President of the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine. And Dr. Penny Ward, Chair of the Education and Standards Committee of the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine, and a medical doctor working in the National Health Service. Along the way, we've had a series of 4 people on my committee, Francis Crawley, Zoya Panelou, Peter Juland, and Malcolm Brown, who have done an amazing job in putting this all together at short notice. So thank you very much for those. So Tim, let me start with you, if I may, and we will come to other questions eventually. Can you answer this question? Pharmaceutical medicine as a discipline and in practice successfully contributed to the COVID-19 pandemic? And if it has, in what ways yes, and in what ways no?
Well, thank you very much, Alastair. This is a very, very important question, because this particular pandemic probably will be one of many that we face over the next couple of decades. And I think there was a lot of learning gained in many countries with the previous SARS and MERS pandemics. But perhaps as an industry and as a profession working in the industry, we didn't really pick up that well in terms of understanding the impact of these viruses in terms of society and in terms of the population. I think this has been an extraordinary experience for us all. The economic hit has been profound, but the dreaded fear of getting pneumonia and being admitted to hospital has had an enormous bad and, I think, perversive effect upon us all. And I think it has stymied a lot of thinking. It's caused us to become much more defensive in terms of our work, and perhaps not thought broadly enough about the nature of the illness. Perhaps I could just very quickly, before I get into talking about the contribution of pharmaceutical physicians, I'd just like to say that the health sciences have made an enormous impact on our knowledge about this illness in the space of 6 months, an enormous amount. And I want to focus primarily not on the work that we are all very familiar with now about the virus itself and how it behaves and how it's affecting significant susceptible people within our society, but it's also our learning about the illness. This is absolutely different than any of the other viral pandemics that we've seen in the last 20 years. It's very different than the influenza H1N1 pandemic in terms of how it affects the lung. Very striking differences between that and the current pneumonia. And there's also very big differences between the SARS and the MERS pneumonias as well. What we're seeing is an illness that strikes blood vessels in a very severe manner, causing widespread endothelial injury and thrombosis. And this learning has come not
We're losing you, Tim.
From the indicated industry per se, but from pathologists who have spent some time from previous disease, has many hidden components to it, because once developed, it may well present late after discharge from hospital with illnesses such as coronary vascular disease, and in the late stages of people in their care in hospital with renal failure. And it's predominantly driven by this endothelial injury and associated thrombosis. And I think we've not seen anything like this before. And it tells us quite a lot, I think, about our lack of knowledge about the viruses and their effect upon us, because very little has been looked at since probably the very early illnesses, the first influenza pandemic. So I think that knowledge base that has really come to the fore over the last month or so is extraordinarily important, and it has been provided by a lot of academic work. And I think it is our duty as pharmaceutical physicians to understand the disease in all its varieties, and in particular, the relatively mild symptoms of the influenza virus going into a much later and advanced and aggressive illness, which is then striking really at the vascular bed, particularly in the lung, but elsewhere in the systemic circulation. This, I think, is a very interesting but important distinction between the phases of the illness and has a very big impact upon what we should be studying in the way of treatments. So I'll stop there with the background, if you like, to the contributions made by many people other than industry and the pharmaceutical physicians. But what about the pharmaceutical physicians? We have done, I think it's 2,100 registered studies, some of them extraordinarily large, 50,000 patient studies comparing up to 5 drugs. We've done probably a large number of what I describe as unique molecule studies, which are going into phase 1 and also into phase 2. Some of our panelists today are contributing to organization of some of that work, but I'll leave that for them to comment later. But that is an enormous amount of work achieved and started within the space of 6 months. In addition to that, there's a lot of work that has been done in the background in providing the medicines and performing all the necessary authoritative work in order to get the studies begun, providing the skills for that from our regulatory groups, from our pharmacovigilance groups. An enormous amount of work has been done. And to run these studies in many, many different countries, quite a number of them are international and involve many different centers. And the medical contribution to this very often is at the heart of the design of the study and the trying to understand the minutiae of the advantages of some of the medicines in terms of treating the disease. So that is, I think, what we have done. Perhaps what we haven't done, though, and this is an important aspect to our work, we have not assisted some of the decision-making within society. We have not assisted enough in that area. It's very interesting in this regard because we meet weekly with Chris Whitty, our CMO, and discuss most of the changes that have been introduced in terms of care of patients. But I'd just like to put it in its context. There have been relatively few studies in terms of those avoidance of contamination, killing off virus on surfaces, dealing with what I describe as all the problems of nosocomial infection between staff in hospitals and care homes and themselves and the patients. There's been very little done in that area. And this, I think, is an area that pharmaceutical physicians could contribute to quite considerably. For the NIHR, there's about 56 studies that have been registered. Very few of them look at these sort of aspects of care. And they do require very detailed scientific work. So if there is any person who is, I think, willing and still free from other occupational demands, then this is an area that is of great need, I think, in our society, particularly as we're entering this period of lower emphasis on the lockdown. So I think that's the one big area that I think we've failed to cover as well as we should. So far as the
Tim, stop you a second, because I think can we move on to some of the other speakers, and we'll come back to you in a moment.
Thank you.
And I would encourage everybody online to put questions, challenges, to put them in the chat, and we will raise them. So, Alan, can I come back? How have patients been taken into consideration by during the pandemic, and for COVID-19 patients, or patients not affected by COVID-19, but whose needs are real? How have we participated?
Thanks, Alastair. In thinking about this question, I've actually divided patients in the population into four groups, quite arbitrarily. I think we need to think about the patients with COVID-19 and how we've got them and used them in COVID-19 studies. The second group of patients I think we need to think about are those patients in clinical studies that were ongoing at the time of the pandemic started and what's happened to them and the impact of that. The third group is patients who have not got COVID-19 but have got other diseases like cancer or cardiac disease, etc. And the final group is those patients, in fact, the rest of us, and we're all patients at times, about the information that we've been able to get and how we communicate that. So things like, should everybody take chloroquine and things like that. So just dealing with those. So if I start first of all with the clinical trials and the patients that went into the studies and are continuing to go into the studies, Tim's already highlighted when this started, we actually knew very little about the disease and the impact on human beings and what was happening. We had some ideas, but some of those ideas actually went out of the window because, as a good example, many of the patients and severe patients developed what we would call acute respiratory distress syndrome as ARDS. And initially, the doctors treating those patients were treating them in a certain way like they would an ARDS patient. But it soon became fairly obvious quite quickly. This was not just like ARDS, it was something else was happening. And for instance, the best way of looking after these patients was having them in the prone position when on ventilators and things like that. So we learnt about the patients and how to treat them as we went along. And of course, this then had an impact on the clinical studies and the clinical study designs. And one of the things I think we had to think about with the patients, many of these patients were severely ill. The last thing they want is lots of assessments being done. So in the design of the studies, I think the key to to a lot of the studies was trying to keep it simple and not do too much to these patients, but just get out the absolute minimum that you need in terms of the endpoints to demonstrate efficacy of the treatments going in and the safety side of things. So I think, there was that group of patients that we had. The next group were clearly those patients who were in clinical trials, but because of the COVID-19, many trials came to a halt and were held up. We couldn't get monitors into hospitals, we couldn't get the data out. And fortunately, the regulatory authorities acted fairly quickly and sought advice from many people, including many of the pharmaceutical physicians, about what they could do and couldn't do and be a lot more flexible. And I think that's been quite a learning experience for us in terms of our flexibility. And it's things like patients being allowed to receive oncology treatments at home rather than having to go into hospital. And there was quite a big emphasis then on changing actually how patients received their clinical trial therapy. Up until now, well, it had to be done by a pharmacy, it had to be in a certain site, etc. And that's all changed. So it was quite a big impact. The other big impact so the third group are patients who are ill, not in clinical trials, who need treatment. Now, I think really this group of particular patients got left behind. And it's only recently have we now started thinking about how we're getting the health service and other ways of treating these patients around the world back into their treatment and treatment regimes. I think, from what I hear, I think a lot of oncology patients have suffered because of that and not being able to get their treatments. In fact, their early diagnosis and early therapies that were needed and surgery. So that's been a big impact. And then lastly, it's the advice to everybody else. We saw lots of things, being talked about, should we try chloroquine? Should we be doing this? Should we be doing that? And one of the things that I think we've, as certainly some of us have been involved in, is actually working with the media and trying to, get the right messages out. I know some of us have been working with the BBC and BBC Reality Check about the key things and the truths around it. Should I continue to take my non-steroidals, for instance, or should I stop that? Should I carry on with my ACE inhibitors? And all that information we've contributed to it. And of course, as President Trump and his advice, that's caused quite a lot of issues. Should we have disinfectant intravenously, etc.? So it's all those sort of things. So I think, in summary, there's broad groups of patients. There's those that are eligible for clinical studies and how we've dealt with those. There's the patients in the other ongoing clinical studies which are not COVID related. There's those patients with other illnesses and how they've, I say, really been left behind, but hopefully we'll catch up and get those back into the proper treatment pathways. And finally, the rest of us that need general advice about how to cope with COVID and what we should do about it.
Thank you very much, Alan. So I now hand over to Penny. Penny, how has pharmaceutical medicine contributed to global cooperation in responding to the pandemic? So we've heard something from Alan, but yeah, how has the pharmaceutical industry been contributing to it, or how not?
Well, I think this breaks down into several clusters as well. So firstly, of course, even though we do have a pandemic going on, we still have to be able to supply a range of medical devices, medical diagnostics, and also medicines for other conditions which require continuation. So, with air traffic and other activities severely curtailed, the industry has had to considerably rework some of its supply chains to enable countries which needed to sustain supplies, for example, of anesthetic medicines, which are often just-in-time delivery slots. We needed to be able to ramp up production and to be able to supply those in the face of shrinking supply transportation issues. The second thing is that the diagnostics industry has had to accommodate very rapidly the development of nucleic acid testing systems and also of antibody detection systems to enable people affected by the disease to be appropriately diagnosed and treated during, or managed, I should say, both from an epidemiological perspective, so that we could understand the spread of infection in the community, to understand the curve of viral dynamics and its relationship to the various pathophysiological presentations of the disease. And lastly, to design, having understood some of the pathophysiology, to then supply medicines that might have helped to alleviate some of those symptoms, including repurposing of anti-cytokine therapies to try to reduce the cytokine storm that contributes to the acute respiratory distress syndrome, and also complement inhibitory factors and anticoagulants, which help with the endothelial damage and the complement or the coagulation cascade abnormalities that seem to be related to the later stage of disease. And all of those have had to be facilitated, again, in the context of manufacturing areas, perhaps in parts of the world that were initially affected by the pandemic, and reducing the ability of the big factories in China in particular, which has become a major manufacturing center for many medicines, to keep supplies ongoing. And in many respects, as the pandemic hit the other parts, further flung areas from China, it was a relief, I'm sure, to many companies that the manufacturing activities in China were ramping up just as the pandemic was hitting its hardest in those parts of the world. I think the other aspect of pharmaceutics and is the assisting with the design of clinical trials, and in particular encouraging individuals to conduct clinical studies that have really meaningful outcomes. It's in this type of scenario, it's and you will have noticed this very early on in the publication cascade from China. It became sort of standard for people to put out lots of publications of case series. And indeed, those helped us enormously in understanding the underlying molecular basis of the disease, to understand something about the virus, and also how the later cascade of illness was evolved during the following initial viral infection, the progression to acute respiratory distress syndrome, and the coagulopathy associated. But that doesn't help to validate that a particular line of therapy has a particular impact. And indeed, I think Gilead Sciences should be congratulated on the energy that they put into considerably ramping up the development of remdesivir, which fortunately has shown some promise in alleviating the disease, in accelerating time to recovery, and preventing downstream effects if given early enough in the disease process. And when you consider that at the outbreak of the disease in China, they had very, very limited manufacturing, to now being able to supply many hundreds of millions of doses is really quite a significant effort on their part.
Thank you very much, Penny. So we've got a few facts coming through already. Please feel free to send a message to us, questions and so on. I know some of you are thinking, well, we're presenting slides and presentations, but we're not. We're here to have a conversation and a chat. So Zoya sent me an interesting fact, which is, as of today, there are 224 potential treatments under investigation for COVID treatment, and 152 vaccines. So you can see there's a lot of work going on in a range of different areas, and hopefully some of them will come to fruition. I've also got a couple of questions. I'm going to ask Alan first for his first question, which is, and this might surprise you, how closely should pharma companies be involved in politics? So basically, President Trump has decided to cut funding to the WHO within the COVID-19 epidemic. And should we as pharma companies, take a public stance to agree or disagree with this decision? What do you think, Alan?
If I start with the general points, I think first, should companies get involved in politics, and then get on to decisions that, like President Trump has made. I think, quite honestly, if companies are seeing things happening out in the world and that really aren't, should we say, right, or not moving in the right direction, then I think they should be getting involved and commenting. And certainly during the pandemic, certainly in the early days, there were so many sort of ideas about therapies or even non-therapies being put forward to treat these diseases, and some of them by very senior people out there with good reputations previously. I think it's up to the companies to say, no, look, this is wrong. This isn't right, and we shouldn't be doing that. And again, I think we have seen some decisions being made because of political reasons. About, for instance, the lockdown. Should we lock down? Shouldn't we lock down? And things like that. And again, if they've got information, if companies have got information, I think it's right that they do get involved in the political side to say yes or no, because after all, as doctors in companies, we have a responsibility to clearly do no harm, and so we should speak out. Opposite things like President Trump pulling away from saying they're not going to pay money to the World Health Organization. Again, the World Health Organization is there for a reason. It's been there a long time. Perhaps rather than just making a sudden decision, perhaps we could engage with more discussion about it, trying to shape it better, perhaps, and try and influence it that way. And likewise, as companies, we could also comment on that. So I don't think we should be ashamed of getting, or frightened of getting, not really ashamed, but frightened of getting involved in politics, providing it's for the right reasons.
Thank you, Alan. Just for those of you who may not be aware, Sir Patrick Vallance, who's the Chief Scientific Officer in the Department of Health, used to be part of the pharmaceutical industry and a physician as part of GSK, so is in a very different way. Tim, I've got a question for you. We're starting to get some questions. So who determines ethics? So Google and Apple have taken a very public stance in relation to how their phones should be used for contact tracing. So insisting on a decentralized process to properly work with their companies. So to what extent should pharma companies own the ethical questions that come from vaccines, from medicines, specifically in relation to COVID-19? What do you think?
Well, I think Penny's touched upon this a little bit already, and that is that I think one of our jobs as pharmaceutical physicians is to emphasize and illustrate
We're losing you again, Tim.
the need for, and I think this is part of our dynamic process of responding to publications which are inadequate, and also putting forward particular areas that have been perhaps underrepresented in terms of interest. I think our ethical job is to ensure that the publications are correct and that we struggle and keep down what I describe as all the fake news stuff. Penny's touched upon very fast publications which have been criticized, but they've had the advantage of bringing out a lot of information which otherwise may have taken 6 to 7 months to get published. But I think the main thing is this irritating business of incorrect data about molecules and treatments. I've seen one of the questions that have been raised about the Lancet paper on hydroxychloroquine, which is extraordinarily badly written and doesn't in fact include any of the data which they've analysed. And I'm hoping that there'll be lots of letters going back to the Lancet questioning some of that, particularly the pharmacology of it, because hydroxychloroquine is a well-recognised medicine for at least 3 illnesses. It's got a very well-known record for problems with regard to cardiac dysrhythmias, and it also has a lot of drug-drug interactions. But the reality is, it's partly because of how it's delivered. You know, we take it by mouth, and we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing these studies with oral treatments when for the last, since 1967, we've been inhaling drugs for lung disease in order to reduce the systemic effects of those drugs. And it's just so surprising that we haven't got round to inhaling hydroxychloroquine. That would be a much safer way of delivering such a drug and would target the site where allegedly it's supposed to work. But I leave that. But I think this issue about facing down incorrect information is one of the most important tasks that we can do. Writing and responding to papers and publications is extremely important. And I think joining debates such as this and pointing out the errors that have occurred. There's one other area that I think is very important in terms of ethics, and that is that we have embarked upon some very small studies which have not given information to us. We've also embarked upon very large studies which are becoming, perhaps some of them at least, redundant in terms of what we now know about the disease. And I think we should speak up about this because it is putting patients through a study perhaps unnecessarily, or even avoiding some of the treatments in the multi-limb studies that would be effective for them. So I think we have quite a big role in terms of the ethics of undertaking research at this time. And it's particularly important because of the dangers associated with this illness and the fact that each patient actually is volunteering to undertake a study at extremely high cost to themselves. And I think for that reason, every patient who enters a trial is a precious person, and we should recognise that. Alastair, is that a good enough answer?
Yeah, that's fine. I've got a comment from Sanjay, who basically says the experience of the last few months has been a generally positive one. At an executive level, there are many examples of agile collaboration between industry, government, and clinical academia, which is great. However, they also mention at the same time they've witnessed many regulatory challenges in setting up and establishing COVID-specific projects, even though we've already described a large number of them. So is there anything that we can do moving forward to remove the barriers to do that sort of work? What do you think, Penny?
Well, my experience actually recently in helping with set up a variety of different trials of phase 2 medicines to show some proof of concept before moving drugs into larger scale trials has been extremely positive with the MHRA. Yeah. The MHRA were quite early in setting up what they called a pre-assessment group, and the clinical trials group took an early look at protocol designs and protocol structures to give advice on areas that they themselves might struggle with. I haven't been involved in international studies, and it may be that in some countries, particularly where there's been some resource constraint, that they may have been more difficult for those countries to accommodate the very rapid moving activities. I think it's also always useful to remember when you're dealing with the regulator that you need to put yourself in the shoes of the regulator and ask what they need to know. So one of the common features that lead to regulatory difficulty, shall we say, is failing to give a good enough scientific rationale for what it is you're trying to do. So you need to think about the information that you're supplying, and indeed the information you may need to generate in order to support the assertions that you're making about potential for an agent to have particular types of effects in certain types of COVID-19 patients. So examples of that, of course, are that some companies have actually have conducted some preclinical work to document the way in which their particular molecules have impacted viral replication in cell cultures. Other companies have done some preclinical work in animal in vivo models of disease to evaluate exposure levels that may alleviate certain symptoms or signs of, in particular, the pneumonic and inflammatory portions of the disease. Because the other aspect of treatment is that you cannot necessarily assume that the dose that you're using for the normal use of the product will be relevant in the situation of a COVID-19 subject. And in the absence of having explored that potential, it may be difficult to justify the dose levels and the side effect profile of an agent that you're trying to move into a different setting. And I found that by encouraging people to think through those questions and to revamp the information that has been available for these agents, that actually regulatory barriers have been reduced, because there is clearly been an attempt to understand the pathophysiology, the place of the drug in that pathophysiology, and to rationalize why the proposed design of the program is appropriate in that altered condition.
Okay, thank you, Penny. We've got another question from...
No, can I just add something to what Penny's been saying? Because my experience, like Penny's, has been very positive with the regulators and the Health Research Authority, even getting email replies on a Saturday and a Sunday evening.
Yes, and Sunday and bank holidays.
Yes, that's right. So they really were working very hard. And of course, we also have the other mechanisms and networks that were put up, and how to contact to talk about medical devices, diagnostics, and things like that. All that was there, and people really have worked very hard. I've also had experience of the FDA, because we've put quite a few things to the FDA And again, they've been very responsive in setting up meetings, even pre-IND meetings. In fact, they recommended the best way in is put a, send write to us, let us know you've got an idea. We'll make a note of that. They give you a number, and then you use that number to get fast track to talk to them. And again, that's been very positive. I think the key thing, like Penny has touched on it, is actually providing very straightforward and sort of simple information. They're just interested in order to assess the things and the programs, just the key facts. They don't want a full investigational brochure putting in and things like that. They really want to know what the endpoints are and what the benefits are likely to be. So it's all about, from our side, using some common sense in communicating with them, but then you get responses. But as I say, my impression is it's been overall very positive. And I think perhaps we can learn from that in the future.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a question from Honorio Silva, who basically said the COVID pandemic is an opportunity to create awareness on the value of medicines development to leverage health in our communities. And Tim had referred to the contribution made by pharmaceutical physicians across the world. So the question is, I wonder whether the faculty had considered a communication plan among our internal and external stakeholders on the value of our discipline and profession. What do you think, Tim?
This is a great question, actually, and thank you very much, Honorio. I think we share a similar view that it is very important to emphasize how much support that is given by the professional pharmaceutical physicians and also the other medicine developers in terms of society as a whole. I think we've touched upon earlier in the discussion today on how much work has been done. A lot of that has been designed, affected, and regulated and reported on by our professional group. But I do feel that we have not integrated our activities in terms of our communications. It would be great to have IFAP Academy, PharmaTrain, the faculty, all the national associations to contributing to a single letter of thanks to our patients who've entered the studies, but thanks also to our collaborators in academia, as well as all the people who have facilitated what has been an enormous effort in terms of research and discovery. So I think we should take a note from you, Honorio, and perhaps start some discussions as to how we do advertise what our professional group does. So thank you for your question.
So we have another question from Anurag. Do we need IEC approvals for online surveys on symptoms and treatments? And then what is the approach for online surveys of patient experiences as part of real-world data gathering? Alan, do you have a view on that?
Yes. For the online surveys, I think it would be, it depends what you're asking, but I think it would be best at least to ask, the ethics committees if you do need approval for such things. Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. It's actually a fine line, I think, but if you're in doubt, I think the best way to do it is to do that. And in terms of online surveys for patient experiences, again, I think for that you should at least write a protocol. If it's not interventional, clearly you don't need regulatory approval to do it. But again, I think you would need to consider the ethics about what you're asking and the nature of that. And of course, you do need to take, of course, the GDPR regulations and guidelines and how you're gathering that data and what you're going to do with it, of course. So that's my view.
And whether or not it's identifiable, because obviously if the information that you're collecting is identifiable to a subject, that's a different scenario than if it's completely anonymous information.
Okay. So Penny, let me ask you another question, and it's not on the list, so you haven't seen it yet. And there's a published article on pediatric regulators which we've been sent, which we can share with people. But let me ask you a more specific question, which is, what can and what must we, as a group of pharmaceutical physicians, improve as a whole community to better prepare for and respond to public health emergencies, where the medicines we create, the vaccines and diagnostics are really urgent global needs. So what can we do to improve that work?
Well, I had a little bit of experience from my time at Roche in pandemic planning, as it were, and there were a couple of scenarios that we got involved with during my time there. One was actually the Gulf War, interestingly, which wasn't a public health emergency, but it certainly represented a sudden surge requirement demand. There are several aspects of pharmaceutical work that really need to be thought through, and I think companies would do well to think through again. The first of these is the what if kind of scenario, and we've just had an object lesson in what if in the context of surge demand in every country on earth for a variety of different supply chains, personal protective equipment, ventilators, diagnostics, and so on. And of course, huge demand for novel medicines and vaccines to prevent disease. The other aspect of it is thinking through how business can continue, because the pharmaceutical industry and devices industry will always be in a position where what we produce will remain in demand, despite everything, all the difficulties that we may be encountering. So companies themselves need to have some view about how they would both respond to this enormous surge and how they would deal with it, and also how they would maintain their business in the face of considerable disruption, not only to travel and supply lines, but communications and manufacturing aspects, maintaining your factory, even though the surrounding area may be affected by particular disease or disaster. And that may lead in the future perhaps to considerations of whether focusing all of the manufacturing in very limited numbers of sites is entirely wise, and that may alter how we approach the manufacturing aspect in terms of, and that may have knock-on benefits obviously for global warming and other things, and job retention in certain countries. So did that address the question?
Yeah, that did. Thank you very much. And just an observation. So I work for Norgine as Chief Development and Medical Officer. We have two factories, one in Wales, one in France, and we manufacture a whole load of medicines. Some people would say, well, they're not the COVID-19 products, but actually, fundamentally, we're delivering product to people. We've had to maintain product supply, ship it around the world, and actually, fundamentally, the feedback we get from patients and from physicians is incredibly positive. And as an industry, I think we need to showcase some of the really good things that we do. And actually, fundamentally, there's a question here from Lucy Pavesi. Do you think the pharmaceutical industry will be seen in a more positive light after COVID-19? What do you think, Penny?
I would like to think that we would be. I think it may depend on the price of remdesivir.
Yeah. What do you think, Alan?
Yeah, I'd like to think so, given what we've done. And, you know, as Penny just mentioned, the price of remdesivir, I think also what's the price of the vaccines going to be? Because
indeed,
if you think about it, this pandemic has cost the world an enormous amount of money just to cope with it. And really, if we had a vaccine, look at the amount of money we will have saved. So I think it's going to be, an ethical, a commercial. It's going to be quite interesting. Should we just sell it out at cost, should anybody make a profit on a vaccine for a condition like this? It's going to be an interesting debate, I think.
Tim, your view?
Well, I'm much less concerned about the price of the product as the fact that we'd have a product that works. I think if we deliver a vaccine that does in fact provide people with a couple of years of protection against a virus like this, I think that would be marvelous. And touching upon Alan's point, it's cost, I think, the world currently about $15 trillion, this epidemic. So I think that's worth an enormous amount in terms of a vaccine that prevents this happening again for the next 3 years. I suspect that we probably won't have a vaccine that'll do that, but I think we'll have a number of exercises that we can offer that take some of the fear out of the public's imagination about how bad this illness can affect them, particularly the inability to help people when they're really sick. I think if we had treatments for that, again, it would have the similar sort of impact on society. I do believe we are being viewed in a different way than perhaps we were this time last year. But I think it's going to be a very, very hard task in terms of convincing people that things do indeed work. And do remember that even last year, when we were going out for the influenza vaccinations in September, it was estimated that we were probably only going to get 50% of people taking up the vaccine. So I think there are very, very big and important questions that we have to take on with society as a whole, and that's the value of the therapy when it is available, and also if the vaccine does work, to ensure that people are not put off it by fake data. You know, I think we have a very big component of our work is to convince people about the relative benefit and risk associated with all medicines, indeed most human activities. And I think that's the message that we should be getting across to society. And if we do that properly, I think people will respect us much more. Sorry for taking so long, Alastair.
That's fine. So there's a comment from Gillies O'Brien-Tier, who basically said we're likely to get several vaccines, some of which have got suboptimal efficacy but are still usable. Then we have a question from Colonel Gulati, who talked about public health emergencies have reported a high mortality among BAME community without giving insights as to why this is. And does anybody have a particular point of view on this?
I have a quick explanation for it. Whether or not it's correct is another answer, but it is there is a pediatrician working in St. Louis who is very keen on thrombotic microangiopathy, that's TMA, which occurs in children after they've had human stem cell transplants. And her work and that of several others have demonstrated that the TMA occurs much more commonly if people have a large number of polymorphisms in their complement cascade genetics. Now, this is terribly interesting because it does track to those parts of the world which have had problems with endemic tuberculosis and serious bacterial infections such as Neisseria meningitidis. And I think it's just a very interesting observation, quite solid in terms of the numbers of patients studied. But again, I suspect it's only part of the story, but it's a very interesting one.
Yes, there are some racial characteristics that relate to the tissue distribution of the ACE2 receptor, which is the preferred receptor of entry for the virus. Sure. And unfortunately, those seem to be more heavily represented in portals of entry in the BAME community races than in the Caucasian race. There are some other factors which link to crowding of individuals, and of course, depending on the social makeup of the country and how that sits against housing stock, then overcrowding is another mechanism for rapid transmission of a highly infectious disease.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of comments. So the vaccine question was raised. Just for people's information, on the 1st of July, we have a clinical research and development in public health emergencies session on vaccines. So that's 4 weeks away rather, 1st of July. So we will go very specifically into a range of different areas in the webinar series. So the second one is therapeutics. The third one is vaccines. We then do pediatrics, rare diseases, cancer, data and knowledge sharing, and then ethical issues arising. So we have a whole series of different elements related to that. And I think, hopefully you will find this interesting. Yolanda Alvarez has said, would you think the creation of this virus could have been avoided if there had been more control on laboratories? If this was the root cause, was it in China? Who knows? How could we avoid this from happening again if possible? What do you think, Alan?
So I was a houseman in Birmingham during the smallpox outbreak. I was a houseman in Birmingham during the last smallpox outbreak in the UK, which was in 1979, when a smallpox vaccine escaped from a public health laboratory in the Birmingham area, and we had some excitement, shall we say, and a couple of deaths, unfortunately, of the lab staff, in fact. I don't think there is any evidence really, apart from Professor Trump, that this particular virus originated in a laboratory, but actually did pass into the human species from an animal vector and related to the trade in wildlife in China. And indeed, the civet cat was the mechanism for SARS, the camel is the mechanism for MERS, and it would appear that bats and perhaps pangolins are the mechanism for SARS-CoV-2. So, however, that doesn't alter the fact that once you have a highly pathogenic virus of this kind, that laboratories have to be able to contain it satisfactorily. And so good laboratory techniques and care in handling of materials is always important in preventing nosocomial transmission.
Okay, so I'm going to say stop now. Thank you very much, everybody. We have had some further questions related to vaccines and non-vaccines, looking into treatments and so on. Those webinars will be available next week, 2 weeks, and then 4 weeks, and then you'll see further ones coming out, and they will be administered from the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine. I'd like to thank all the panelists. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank particularly the Ethics Practice Committee. I think they did a great job in pulling everything together. We've got some great speakers coming from around the world over the coming weeks. Thank you again for the sponsor, our first webinar, Indigo Medical. And our next webinar will be on the 17th of June 2020. Where we are talking about clinical research and development in public health emergencies, and specifically talking about therapeutics. And then 2 weeks later, we're talking about vaccines. Registrations for those two are now open. So click on the link in the chat function to complete any online feedback that you've got, whether you like it, don't like it, give us some feedback so that we can determine that we can make it a little bit better. And also, when you do the online feedback form, you will receive a certificate of attendance. So you need to complete the form. So thank you very much, all of the representatives here. Thank you for the organisers, for the committee that put it together. I really appreciate the work you've done, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alastair, for chairing the meeting so well. So thank you, and thank you everybody for attending. Brilliant. I very much welcome you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.